Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of scripturalworks.com. And I'm Greg Camp, and I'm here with my co-host, co-editor, Patrick Spencer. Patrick, it's great to have you here today.
Glad to be back. This is going to be a fun podcast, I think.
I think this is a good one. A couple of really good passages looking at some stereotyped women in both Acts 16 and Joshua 2. And this is part of our continuing series on episodes and stories in Luke and Acts. In this case, Acts. So, you have some good stuff for us today.
Well, we will find out and see if our audience agrees with us at the end of the hour. But certainly this is a text that historically we've read in one way, and there's been a lot of attention paid to Acts 16, as many in our audience knows, due to the great work the feminist scholars have done and the concentration around Lydia in particular. But we're going to challenge some of those assumptions and suggest that, some of the stereotypical readings that we've had are stereotypically wrong. We'll find out.
All right. This sounds exciting. Well, before we launch into that, let's start with an ad from our sponsor. Are you ready to take your calling deeper? Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology offers master's, doctoral, and certificate programs designed to equip ministers, scholars, and leaders for transformative service. Whether you're pursuing a Master of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry, or a graduate certificate in practical ministry, Abilene Christian University's flexible online and on-campus options help you grow in faith and impact. Learn more at acu.edu/GST. That's acu.edu/GST. Well, before we try to complicate the story, let's get into how we usually read Acts 16, especially when it comes to a couple of key figures. Lydia, the slave girl, we have a jailer who's in on this, and supposedly their conversions. Before you get into answering that question, also want to let people know that if you are interested in going to see Philippi, where this event takes place, we're sponsoring a tour there and to Greece and Turkey this summer in mid-June to the first couple of days of July. So send us an email if you're interested, and we'll send you the information.
So what email should they should simply contact you on LinkedIn or Facebook, Greg? How do they?
They can do that at greg@scripturalworks.com or patrick@scripturalworks.com, and we will send out the brochure. We will also get it posted up to the website for you to look at there. Yep. So walking around the city of Philippi and going around to the location of Lydia, there's a little stream there that they say is the place that Paul met Lydia. You, of course, get all the warm, fuzzy vibes of sticking your toes in the cool water where perhaps Lydia was working or praying or whatever she was doing when she met Paul. So how would we normally read this story that gives us such good feelings?
That's a great question. And for our audience, I don't get to go, unfortunately, but Greg is hosting the tour. So you get the better of the two of us to begin with, but we want to encourage
we have great tour guides
to check it out. Contact Greg, get more information, because he's been there a number of times. He has experience hosting these tours, and I wish I were going, to be quite candid. And then I could actually say I've been to Philippi, which I have not been, and wish I had. So one of these days I'll take Greg up on his trip offer and actually go with him. So to your point, Greg, it's a great question. Acts 16, particularly in recent years, the last, say, 30 years or so, has been there's been a lot more attention paid to the episode than was in the past. It showcases women, as you said, in prominent, and we've typically interpreted in very positive roles. Lydia is the first named convert in Europe, often presented as a strong, economically powerful woman who shapes the early church. And that certainly is true on some fronts, and on other fronts, we're going to challenge that during today's podcast. It's seen as a liberation text. More of the focus there is on the actual slave girl, and we've seen slave girls appear a couple times in Luke Acts up to this point, and it occurs once again here. But it's someone who is oppressed, is possessed, follows Paul and Silas and the we group around, and is freed of that spiritual oppression. So from a liberation standpoint, they see that as a positive thing. And Paul's ministry is seen as confronting systems where men profit, specifically, if you add the liberation and the feminist angle to it, to men who profit from a woman's body and the gift that she actually had. And then there's another way in which it's typically read, probably more from the two traditions that we come from, where it's a conversion experience. It's the baptismal template, if you may. Those who listened to Stan a few podcasts ago heard him articulate that it should not be used as a blueprint for the early church. That was not the intent of Acts, and I wholeheartedly agree with him on that front. But there's a number historically, recently, and going back hundreds, probably thousands of years, who've used this as a blueprint for understanding conversion, the household conversion with Lydia, the household conversion of the jailer. It's a how-to conversion, basically, guidebook. That's how it's been used historically. From a caricature standpoint, you look at Lydia, they see her as affluent, God-fearing. She's a purple seller, but they really see it more as a purple dyer. I don't think she's a purple dyer. She could be, but it's more emphasized as a purple seller when you look at the Greek from Thyatira. She's a female patron. The focus is on her, as I said, as a dyer, not as a purple seller typically. She's seen as controlling her own household. She uses her wealth and her home to support Paul, Silas, and the we group. Or the we group actually disappears. I don't think they ever make it there, but she wants them to come there. And then we usually miss that. We'll talk about that in a moment. And it's often linked to the broader pattern of other female patrons in Luke Acts, and there are some. Look at Luke chapter 8, for example, where you look at the Mary and Martha episode in Luke chapter 10, and you have other instances of it as well. Then you have the Python girl, the Pythian girl. She's a young slave girl. She has a Python, Pythona spirit, and she generates, the text says, a lot of profit. Just not profit, but you have this word much profit in front of it for her lords, which is an interesting way to phrase it. It's not her masters or another term, but it's her lords, Kyrie, which is used obviously in reference to Jesus as well. She's trapped in basically triple bondage, if you may: spiritual, she's possessed; social, she's enslaved; and economic. I mentioned the slave girl. We remember my podcast a few episodes ago on Rhoda in Acts 12, and then you have the slave girl who confronted Peter in Luke 22. Then you have the Philippian jailer. I'm almost done here. He's the classic, as I mentioned, conversion question. What must I do to be saved? Which reminds us of the Ethiopian eunuch back in Acts chapter 8. Reminds us of, Acts chapter 2, and so forth. His story becomes basically the go-to text often for those who are looking for a conversion blueprint of personal faith, household baptism, conversion that leads to changed behavior on his part. And the resulting perception of this chapter is it's positive, it's inspiring strong women. It breaks chains, both literally as well as metaphorically in many ways. Whole households become sites of salvation and community. And as I mentioned, it's a model. And so it's a very positive reading or listening experience that we have typically when we look at this chapter. And there's been some wonderful scholarship from a feminist and liberation standpoint, and narrative for that matter, spent on this chapter over the last 20 to 30 years. And we're sort of building on it, which you're going to ask me about here in a moment, I say.
Right. Well, let me just ask a quick clarification. When you say she had a Pythian spirit, a Python spirit, this is not Harry Potter. It doesn't speak parcel tongue. This is like the spirit at Delphi where the
Good
Pythian
point.
spirit
Yeah.
is. So
Some type of spirit that's inspired and seen in a very positive manner by those who are in charge of a Roman district, such as Philippi. That it's seen positively by the population. So when she follows Paul and Silas and the we group around, proclaiming, as she does, it's a positive thing. So readers would wonder, well, why did Paul stop her? She's telling the truth, and it's being received in a very positive manner by the population of Philippi.
Right.
Good question.
And for Lydia being from Thyatira, that's not a local village. That's over in what we know as Turkey. So she's not in her home territory.
Yeah. So much
That's
for
correct.
going to help the Macedonians.
Right. So this is another site that we go on the tour, is to Thyatira. It's in the Lydian territory. The woman's name comes from the territory. So we've got this picture of strong women, liberation, nice conversion stories. But you're suggesting that we should start to see some cracks of that if we pay a little bit more attention, slow down our reading, notice some things that aren't quite right. What is it that we need to be noticing?
No, there's a couple things. That's a great question. And this happens when you do a closer reading of the text, a narrative reading. You're paying attention to narrative aspects, reader aspects, historical or sociological aspects. This is more just reading the darn thing and seeing some of the cracks that appear. In this case, the episode we typically tie to, the very beginning of the Lydia episode, where Lydia starts in verse 11, but it actually probably goes back earlier, the Macedonian man, and we'll talk about that in greater detail in a moment. So, one, it starts earlier than we typically say it does. Paul and the we group, second of all, don't act with really the urgency you would expect when they're called for help in a military manner, conquest type manner by this Macedonian man. They show up and they kind of dink around town. We're going to talk about that in greater detail in a moment. Lydia's hospitality and her faithfulness, when you read the text, it's not confirmed right away. They don't go to Lydia's house right away. She's begging them. She's trying to get them to go to her house so she can show them hospitality and moreover demonstrate her faithfulness. But instead, they go off. They're around town for who knows how long. They exercise the Pythian spirit, and then they tick off her owners who go and get the magistrates. And they throw them in jail and they beat them up, and then they finally get out, and then they finally get around to going over to Lydia's house. That seems very weird to me when you read the narrative, and there's an intentional reason that it's delayed that long, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And the slave girl, in my opinion, also doesn't function like a neat liberation story at all. She just kind of vanishes. It's not like, she's upheld, she believes, and, she's free, but she loses this gift, which basically is a loss of profit, loss of status. It's actually harmful to her, probably. We don't know what happens because she just disappears from the text. So, these things, are cracks, certainly in the narrative. And I think you're going to ask me to delve into these in greater detail.
Yeah,
but
we're going to take those in turn.
It's a disruption, right? Disruptive negations, as Wolfgang Iser says, creates reader experiences or listener experiences in the case of the book of Acts.
So it really makes us question what Luke is highlighting. Is it what we thought it was? Is it this conversion story, as you mentioned, or is it something else that's going on? So let's take that first crack that you mentioned. These are some negations, perhaps, of what we would expect. So you've argued that the episode doesn't really start in 1611, but over in 16:9, when Paul is still over in Asia Minor. What's happening?
We typically read it as sort of the three pieces, right? Verses 11 through 15 is where we see it start, Lydia. And then we say, well, verses 16 through 18, slave girl. And then verses 19 through 40, prisoner and jailer. But then they actually go to Lydia's house at the end of that episode. That kind of messes up that division to begin with, right? But recently there's been a few who've argued that, it doesn't go far back enough. It doesn't start in verse 11, but it starts in verse 9 with the Macedonian vision, to your point, where this Macedonian man appears. He's urging, he's calling Paul, which is the same verbiage that's used to describe Lydia's urging or plea to Paul and Silas and the wee group to actually come to her house so she can show them faithfulness or show them hospitality so she can demonstrate faithfulness. He says, come over here and help us, basically is what he says. And this language, you and I were talking about this beforehand because you know the region much better than I do. It's a Roman colony. It's where Cassius and Brutus were defeated by Octavian and
Mark Antony.
Mark Antony, thank you. Pardon me. I'm having a blank glitch late in the day here. And Macedonia is seen as a place of military triumph and military aid. So by asking them for help, it sort of sets up a military conquest scene, which we'll talk about the connotations and the potential connections with Joshua 2 later on in the podcast. So we have that going on, and then you have this repetition of, urging or calling that's repeated 3 times in this episode, starting with verse 9, which leads me back to the belief that, we've messed up the episode parameters because we haven't gone far back enough in terms of the sequence of the narrative. At the other end in 1640, as we mentioned, they go out of prison, they go into Lydia. We'll talk about that later. And then they encourage, same word used to urge, come over here, help us, that the Macedonian man uses. Same word Lydia uses in, I think it's verse 15, is also used in verse 40, which is a word sort of to connote hospitality in many ways, right? So you have, come help us in verse 9. You have the same word used again in 40. It really forms what those who understand some of the nuances of Greek rhetorical devices. It forms a inclusio where, at the very beginning of the unit, you have a certain number of verbs, and at the very end of the unit, you have some verbs. And sometimes it forms a chiasm as well, where you'll have it break out into A, B, C, B, A parameter. It doesn't do so necessarily in this case, but you at least have that inclusio on the front end and the back end. And as a result, I believe all of this stuff fits together as one unit, and more of it was not read sequentially as 3 separate character groups. And you lose a lot of nuances in the episode if you do not begin at verse 9.
Right. And the fact that the first person you encounter is a woman, not a Macedonian man. And most of the people who live there are Romans, not Greeks.
Our military officers and their families, right? Because they've been settled there. Yep.
Exactly. So we'll post a table that accompanies this, some of this inclusio that you talked about, this bracketing. So we'll for those of you who are watching on YouTube, we'll post this there. Those who want to see those charts and you're listening only, you might want to go click over on that. Well, let's go over to the second crack. You said that Paul and Silas don't immediately rush to the aid of this Macedonian, quote, man, even though it's a woman. But as you say, they kind of dink around in Philippi, which is, by the way, not a very big place. It doesn't seem that they're on a divine mission, certainly not the equivalent of a hurried up military mission. What's happening there?
I don't think I could have explained it any better. You're right. I mean, you get this opening scene, Macedonian man, military campaign, conquest connotations, and you expect, well, they're going to run there quickly, and it sort of starts out that way. The wee group joins them, and they're off, and they're to Philippi, and you expect they're going to do something. There's a lot of action that's going to happen. But instead, the text, which we skip this when we read the narrative, we just miss this aspect, I guess, because we're fixated or interested in other aspects of the narrative. We miss the fact that this verb it means to wear away, rub away time. I call it they dinked around.
They killed time
around town for who knows how long, right? It connotes lingering, loitering, hanging around. Certainly more than marching orders that they got from the Macedonian man, right? And there might be a concept here. It's sort of an ironic connection with, and we're going to talk about Lydia in greater detail. Rusha Macaulay, you can see it. Lydia as a rhetorical construct in Acts. I'll try to provide you the highlights that are useful for your interpretation of this passage. But she argues that there's this concept of Lydian touchstone that's present in this passage, because you have Lydia, Thyatira. Lydia, is very likely named after the location from which she comes. So, there's this, and we'll talk more about Lydia here in a moment, but this Lydia touchstone basically is that you rub away the surface of the gold to really expose the fine metal of the gold. It rubs away. Well, this concept used to describe the activity of Paul and Silas in the we group really is sort of a similar sense in that they're rubbing away time. So there may be a pun going on here where they're rubbing away time, and eventually, as you read through this text, things are rubbed away, and you find out the one who is truly faithful is Lydia, which we'll talk about in a moment. You get this weird tension here. You have the vision, clear, urgent Macedonian man begging for help, and we talked about the rubbing away. They're out. They go outside the gate rather than staying in the city. They're called to the city, and suddenly they're outside of town. They're out by the river, but at a purported place of prayer, which also, in some sense, which she also argues, has some military connotations associated with it. If you look at Old Testament context, we won't talk about those today, but if you referred to her work, you could see what some of those look like. And what we expect to happen here doesn't, right? They're dinking around town.
Yeah, again, it's not a very big town. So what in the world are they doing there? Enjoying some kebabs or whatever they do there. So let's talk about a third crack that you mentioned. Lydia is baptized and she invites them to her house. And of course they go, except that's not how it says. What happens?
Exactly. So Lydia hears the Lord opens her heart. She and her whole household are baptized, as you said. And then there's this enthymeme where and I think we're going to put this up on the screen for those who are watching the actual video, where you have Greg and I study this when we were doing our doctoral work at Berkeley, actually, where you have, a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion, which forms an enthymeme. And basically she says, if you judge me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and stay. And then it says she constrained and prevailed upon them. Two different words that sound very much alike here, right? Where she they come together, their word, which has a rhetorical impact. The Greek authors would use words that sound alike together, so they have a rhetorical impact, if you may. But as you said, they don't immediately go into their house. It takes the end of the story before they do so. And then there's no confirmation, which is what that minor premise that's missing from her statement there, right? You have the major premise, you have the conclusion, you're missing the minor premise. Right. Paul doesn't confirm it, right? She's basically seeking out, exhorting and wanting him to say, yes, you are faithful. He doesn't do it. He keeps dinking around town. Right. The text doesn't call the subsequent activity dinking, but he certainly does not go to her house. They go and they confront the possessed girl, and then they're thrown in jail and so forth. And finally they go, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The major premise, just so everyone's clear, if you're listening to the audio only, is apostles judge faithful people. The implied minor premise is you're treating me like a convert, right? She wants to be treated like a convert. They're not treating her like a convert. They're not going to her house so she can show them hospitality, right? And then the conclusion is, so come to my house, right? So those who don't understand enthymemes will miss this aspect of the text. And I think many of us have. In fact, and only at the very end you find that they went to Lydia's house. We'll talk about the verbiage that is used there. Lydia is the ideal patron reading, right? If she's the ideal patron, they would have gone to her house right away. Yep. So that's a crack in the narrative.
Right. Yeah. And other places in Acts where people invite and they go, you think of Jesus going to Zacchaeus' house immediately, right? This day I will be there. But here they don't. In fact, they end up thrown in jail.
They almost just kind of ignore her, right? She urges them, and pleads with them to come to my house and to confirm her faith, and they won't do it.
Right. Well, let's talk about our next character, this slave girl. And in the Liberation reading, she's very front and center. But the narrative treats her as you might say, as collateral damage. Can you elaborate? She's maybe not as full of a character as we would like her to be.
Yeah, I mean, she disappears. You would think if they're, as the liberation theologians or critics would like us to think, we would see the outcome of her story. But she just kind of disappears, and the focus is on her lords, which are mentioned multiple times in the story. Obviously, it's the lords that get the magistrates riled up and get the magistrates to throw them in jail and to flog them and chain them up and everything else, right? And what's interesting is, at the same time, it's not like Paul saw her, had compassion on her, spotting her or whatever, right? Like Jesus would have, or the Good Samaritan for that matter. And he actually exorcised the spirit from her. The text says for many days she followed him around, and it's just like, this clanging cowbell, whatever, just following Paul and Silas and the wee group around for a long extended period of time. And then, he finally speaks, the spirit immediately leaves her, but then she's gone. She's gone from the narrative. So you would think if the liberation theologians were right, we would have had a lot more focus on her, and she wouldn't disappear from the text. So I think the focus of the text is elsewhere, and it's probably on this concept of prophet, which for anyone who's been following our series or reads Luke Acts will know that that's not a foreign concept at all in the narrative of Luke Acts. And the owners realize, that their hope of profit has gone out. It's gone out. It's left, just like she leaves, sort of. So does the prophet. The prophet leaves with her at the same time. So they get the magistrates riled up, the Roman magistrates who drag Paul and Silas. They get them to the authorities, and they say their customs are not lawful for us Romans. The driving issue here seems to be economic loss, right? Because when she lost that was the possession, the gift, if you may, all value for them dissipated and left with her at the same time. The owner's rage, the story focuses on. It focuses on the actual beating. I mean, you go through all this. It's a pretty violent episode when you actually read through it. The prisoner, the prison they're thrown in the very inner recesses as far back as possible. And these are not modern day prisons by any sense of imagination. When you're talking about prison, you're talking about suffering, you're talking about torture. And that's certainly what's going on here. He even throws shackles on their feet and chains them up that way. The focus is on that, not the ongoing life of this enslaved woman, young girl who just disappears from the narrative altogether.
Yeah, and likewise, we're never told what customs are unlawful. This charge that is brought, really, she functions, it would seem, to announce that their Lord versus her lords, in a sense. But okay, she's freed, but so what happens to her?
We don't know, right? We don't know.
Yeah, just kind of gliding over this. So
because she's gone, then our focus has to turn somewhere else. And in this case, I think it's on the lords and what they instigate as a result because of what happened to them. They lost their prophet. Their prophet left with them.
So
her.
Are there other tensions in this narrative that what we might call a standard reading that we might hear in church or even in a college class tend to glide over? What else do you think is there?
Well, the place of prayer they go to twice in the whole episode, but there's no prayer that happens at either place of prayer, which is kind of interesting, right?
But we assume that
prayer sort of is the site of profit. It's a site of conflict. It's the site of arrest, particularly if you look at the Lydia, right? Lydia, is converted, but then she tries to, get them to acknowledge her faithfulness or loyalty, and they don't. So that's a conflict, if you may, in many ways in the text. And then the real prayer, instead of being at the place of prayer, happens in prison, which is the last place you expect it to actually take place. Who gets help from the Macedonian call is another aspect. Help us, but as you noted, I think Lydia isn't even Macedonian, so they're called.
She's certainly not a male.
They're not helping the Macedonians; they're helping non-Macedonians. The slave girl, is exploited. She leaves the narrative in silence. As you said, the jailer really is the only one whose story is fully resolved, where he receives salvation, and he's joyful. Faithfulness, is another aspect in this text. It's sort of an open-ended question, at least mid-chapter. You have Lydia, if you have judged me faithful to the Lord, come to my house. They don't come to her house. The implication is they don't judge her faithful to the Lord. Because when you see that play within the narrative itself, the jailer later rejoices with his whole household. And the text, I think, asks us to look at these different displays of faithfulness based on the different characters or character groups and play them off of each other, which is syncresis is a frequent, comparison is a frequent activity when you're reading Greco-Roman narrative.
Right. So a lot of things that we assume are happening in the text that if we pay attention actually aren't. Lydia's not there praying as far as we know. Although if you go there today, it's been designed as a wonderful place of prayer. So it kind of feeds that notion that that's what Lydia was doing. And so that's what, Paul found happening there. And you're suggesting that's not in the story.
Yeah.
As some of these other things simply aren't in the story.
No, you're exactly right. When you look at, Lydia and how she's portrayed as a starting point, she's from Thyatira, which is in the region, as you alluded to, in the old Lydian kingdom. If you go with Greg this summer, I'm sure he'll show you all these places. Her name is Lydia, literally the Lydian. As I mentioned in the ancient world, especially, writers like Strabo and other slaves, foreigners, they're often named by the place of their origin. So Lydian likely functions as a label, just not a personal name, but it's quite possible that was her name as well, because people who become free women and men would often use the name from which they derive from where they were from as their actual name. And this is not the first time where Luke would have done something like this, where he uses, naming conventions for people's names. You have Peter, who's called the Rock. You have Barnabas, the son of encouragement. You have Eutychus over in chapter 20, who falls out of the window, who falls asleep. He's kind of unlucky, so they call him Lucky. So Lydia, the purple seller, sort of is a stock figure in many ways. And for a first century audience, they just don't hear Lydia, small business owner, which is what we do when we hear this preached and taught typically, right? Or we read an article in the church newsletter, or the church blog, and so forth. It's usually Lydia, the small business owner, and we view her from a lens of 20th century America in many ways. No, it's the Lydian, a purple seller, and that lights up a whole ethnographic stereotype, as you alluded to, that we're going to talk about.
Well, and she's not there dyeing fabric, because there is no purple dye to be had in that area. That's why it's so popular in Thyatira. They have what is needed there. And so there's something else about her character. She, as you say, this is a stereotype. So what are audiences hearing when they hear a Lydian who's a seller of purple? What's the standard stereotype, not today, but in the ancient world?
Well, we're going to argue that, there's a couple different connotations associated with Lydia. One, it's ethnically, she's not from Macedonia, which is, should make us put up our antennas, because, the Macedonian guy did call Paul and the group to Macedonia, and now they're converting non-Macedonians. We're going to talk about this in a moment, probably seen as morally suspect, economically a bit of a trickster. And that's how Lydians were perceived, and particularly women sellers, women retailers. And then we'll talk a bit about the potential sexual connotations in this passage as well a little later on. So back to your main question here about, the ethnographic connotations. I'll run through some of them here, and I think we'll put up a few things for those who are watching on YouTube. Lydians were associated with fabulous riches. I mean, they were exceedingly wealthy, or that's how they were seen, starting with the king. And it was basically short. If you're a Lydian, you would think, over the top opulence. So you would think Monaco, or, one of the fabulous places in the world where Atherton in the Bay Area, right? Where people who have enormous wealth, that's where they come from. And that's an opulence, over the top opulence, basically. But you also had this concept, you read about Lydians, as I mentioned, there's this lore of prostitution, and a sexualized economy in many ways. Look at Herodotus, for example, where he says, I'll read a couple of things here. All the daughters of the common people of Lydia prostitute themselves before marriage. That's quite a statement, isn't it?
Wow.
That's not a very complimentary statement. But listen to this. They earn their own dowries through sex, not through paternal provision. Not a nice thing to say.
Herodotus has something against Lydians for sure.
No, and he's not the only one who talks about it. There's others that we could cite as well. So the implication is, since all maidens prostitute themselves, all Lydian husbands marry former prostitutes. Sexual commerce is basically built into the basic fabric of society and economic trade, right? Decadent, luxurious living, overindulgence, softness, right, because of the sexual connotation, right? You have Xenophanes, criticizes his fellow Colophonians for learning useless luxury from Lydia. We can go on and I can cite more. We don't have enough time in the podcast. You have purple, back to the concept of purple, in degeneracy, purple dye, cloth. It's seen as a luxury symbol, even in the New Testament. Read Revelation, but you go back in the Old Testament. When you see purple, your antenna goes up. You say degeneracy, luxury, exorbitance, and so forth. Extravagance, if you may. And then there's this concept of anyone who got around these people who have all these suspect areas of disrepute, whether it's overindulgence and greed and luxury, or the sexual connotations we talked about, is seen as having a Lydian disease, that it can spread person to person via trade, friendship, social intimacy, and so forth. It corrupts the social body, the church, if you may, cities, households, networks, even. So the fear is, if you let a Lydian into your social network, you're going to get polluted by luxury, greed, and sexual immorality. So that might explain why, Paul and Silas and the we group kept her at arm's length and didn't accept her plea to come to her house for hospitality.
And it's really tied to the fact that the purple is such a high-end luxury item that the whole culture takes on various aspects of that. It's like Cartier watches, or pick some extravagant luxury, but that's what this region makes its money off of, and presumably that's what she's making her money off of. She's
down selling purple cloth, probably not dyeing it. She could be dyeing it and selling it, but to your point, they didn't dye it. It came from elsewhere in the world. So probably she was a seller, and she was there selling the purple cloth, because that's what the word means that's used to describe her here.
Right.
So she's positioned as a merchant retailer, not a hands-on craftsman, which is what the liberation theologians and readers of the text, as well as the feminist readers of the text, typically want to tie back to, right? We want to raise up her status. I think in recent years that has begun to diminish, that people are acknowledging that's not the case, starting with the book that I referenced. But certainly that's true. And merchants, are, in comedy, and the moralists are cast as thieves, swindlers, liars. If you're a seller of purple, you're probably not the most honest person in the world. That's the stereotype that accompanies Lydia in this case, the way she is described. Manipulates customers, dilutes the product. In fact, there was a whole, I think it's further down, maybe we're going to talk about it now just as well. There's this sham trade around purple goods where you had fake, like LV bags and so forth you have today, where you had fake purple back in the day. And she was a huckster selling it out by the riverside. Hey, come over here. I've got a new bag for you. It's purple. Let me show it to you. It'll fade in a week, but it's purple right now.
Well, and that's given some of the Roman rules around the selling and buying of purple. It's regulated at different points in Roman history. So what's she doing in a place like Philippi, selling purple, and who's going to be brave enough to buy it? I mean, it just raises historical questions, if nothing else. But as you say, it certainly can be used as that an image of a huckster who's trying to sell the wares. Don't go to the bazaar. You might get taken.
Well, and even, after her conversion, the words used to describe her behavior, kind of her, that concept of a retailer who's really pushing it to you to sell you the wares, she urged them, right? Parakaleo. And then this other word, biasato sounds very much alike. She constrained, she pressed hard on us, is what the we group reports here, right? So she's pushing hard, so it raises these kind of, it's sort of a double entendre, right? Is she really being faithful and loyal and doing the right thing here? And she, was the conversion real, or is she acting out her stereotype?
You're making me have a flashback to a vendor in the Plaka in Athens who chased me around. I had to go into the subway to get away. Just a little too aggressive here. So you're suggesting that she could be a rather hard-selling vendor.
It comes across that way. There's this double entendre where those two words that you use to describe her behavior after the baptism can also have those connotations, for sure. And you have this, she's called a God-fearer, who typically are seen as positive figures, respectable sympathizers with the synagogue in the 1st, 2nd century. Yep. But, everything, her actions here with, a description as a worshiper of God, sort of runs against the grain of everything that this typical stereotype brings up in your mind. That's not what you perceive of when you hear Lydian. Oh, a worshiper of God. No, the exact opposite comes to mind, quite frankly. So
is Luke trying to play with that category of a God-fearer?
Might be in this case, for sure, right? And certainly the enthymeme that we have here, where if you judge me faithful to the Lord, come into my house and stay, right? It's, as I mentioned, this concept of the Lydian disease spreading and so forth, that's sort of what all this language calls up for a listener or a reader of this text, that's what she's asking to do. So then you begin to understand why Paul and Silas and the we group kept her at arm's length. They didn't accept her, her urging, her plea, her invitation to come to their house for hospitality. The jailers actually went and offered some hospitality, not her, till verse 40 at least, anyway, right?
So she could be posing some sort of danger to them. At least they think. And are you suggesting that they're a bit wary of whether her conversion is either genuine, or that do they even ask her for some sort of proof of her change?
They don't. What she asks for them to demonstrate their acceptance and belief that she has changed is for them to come to her house. So they weren't, right? So it may be that they felt like she was a contagion, that Lydian disease, and she would introduce that Lydian disease into the church community. It's not like, you go back to the end of chapter 15, which we skip over that. John Mark, that episode where Paul basically says, I'm going to have anything to do with him. I'm going to have anything to do with Barnabas. Goodbye, you guys. And now he's teamed up with Silas. We skip over that. So certainly the church is, and that's not the only instance where that's the case, is concerned about a contagion, a Lydian type disease infiltrating, and maybe that's why they kept them on reading into it, which you can from a reader response standpoint, that's one of the reasons why they didn't go to her house. They didn't accept her invitation for hospitality.
So what do you do with the fact that Paul receives this Macedonian male warrior type call, and what he meets is this, what you're describing is a somewhat aggressive retailer who's aggressive, not about selling goods, but about being accepted by them.
Yeah, it's a narrative
making sense?
gap in a way, right? What does it mean to be faithful to the Lord? Is she faithful to the Lord? It takes a while for people to come to that recognition. Look at Cornelius. it took a lot of machinations, and it's basically a dual repeat of the story as well, or triple repeat of the story, depending on how you want to read it, back in Acts 10 and 11 for the same thing. Paul has to tell his conversion story 3 times of, and the scales fall from, he loses his sight and everything else. It sometimes conversion doesn't happen overnight. Maybe that's one of the connotations that's happening here, that it takes time in order for that to enact and go into effect. Certainly it has by the end of the story, or that's our perception by our reading of, the way the episode concludes. But certainly there seems to be concern on the part of Paul and Silas and others that they didn't want to get too close to this woman because of the stereotype surrounding her caricature in antiquity.
So when you describe her as a huckster, you're not trying to just be cute for a title on the show. What are you trying to name with? No, we would never do that. What are you trying to use with that word in trying to describe her that way?
Well, it's kind of some of the same concepts that we just discussed, right? Is someone who talks people into deals, potentially cheats them, pulls them into questionable networks. That's all connoted by this concept of purple seller, purple retailer, purple merchant. And like I said, merchants and retailers are not seen in a positive manner. Maybe sellers, we need to come up with a different word. There's not a word in English to actually convey what that meant in Greco-Roman, particularly. Right, and then you have the narrative behavior, play on two words as we just discussed. She urges them and then she compels them. I mean, it gets even more intense. Two words that sound very, very, very much alike, right? The spellings are very similar in nature, I think intentionally so. It's this, as we mentioned, this same pushiness you expect from a market retailer. Come, you must come into my stall, into my house, in this case. So it raises the stakes on God's actions. God just doesn't open a neutral heart. He opens the Lydian huckster's heart, right? This mission continues to expand, and it's just not expanding to those who are ready to provide hospitality and have pure moral backgrounds and are from the stereotypes that you want to see as members of the Christian community, but those who are really outside the margins. And we have that happen time and time again, which we've been talking about in this series. And this is another one of those instances in my opinion. So, we have a Lydian purple trading market hawker who, against all societal expectations, is portrayed by Luke as, God-fearing, faithful in the Lord. And she eventually, if you read all the way through the end of the episode, it ends up being the anchor host, in terms of hospitality to the Philippian believers.
But it must have been just as crazy as Zacchaeus, the tax collector, being transformed, or Jesus going and eating with tax collectors,
or the woman at the Pharisee's house back in Luke 7, or think about this. Joshua did a great job of describing this, how it's and Joel does as well in his podcast that we did on the ending of Luke's gospel, how it's part of the scriptural narrative in it, and it harkens back into the Old Testament. How Jesus started his sermon in Luke 4. He cites two Old Testament examples of people who are Gentiles, one, but they're really outside the parameters of the typical person you expect to embrace Yahweh in the Old Testament. Right. And in the New Testament, certainly that's true. And then that plays out in the form of various characters or character groups, as you just mentioned.
Right. And elsewhere in Acts, we get Simon the magician, who seems to convert, but he wants the Spirit for money. He wants to pay for it, and then he wants to maybe use it to gain more money. You got to be careful of those kind of characters within the group. Let's move to a different kind of comparison that you make. You just mentioned the use of syncresis, the comparisons, in various places in Acts. We see that there is some nuancing that's going off of some Old Testament texts. And you suggest that there's a comparison that can be made between what's happening in this story with Lydia and the Rahab story in Joshua 2. How does that comparison work?
Anyone, in my opinion, who is familiar with the Septuagint, the Old Testament, and these texts, which they absolutely were, you can see them quoted all over the place, one could see how you could tie two and two together, and you start to read this episode, particularly what's transpiring with Lydia. It's a conquest scene. It's a military scene. Well, guess what's happening in Joshua 2? It's a conquest. It's a military scene. It's a woman, a suspect that's involved, just like Lydia, Rahab in that particular instance. And you begin to see the parallels, which we have up on our screen, I think. Jericho, first city in the land. You have here Philippi, the first city in Macedonia. They go first stop, right? You have Rahab, who's described in the Greek text as with porne, right? You have Lydia, who's described as this purple seller. Both are suspect in their own ways, right? And then you have men going into their space. The spies enter into the house of Rahab, which, if you read the Hebrew text, certainly has sexual connotations. They both, bow is the Hebrew word, they go in to Rahab, the harlot. Right. In this case, they go into the Lydian. That's literally what it says in verse 40. And she wants them to come to their house. Right. So there's some underlying potential sexual connotations that are going on here. Both are negotiators. Rahab bargains for, righteousness and household preservation. Lydia deploys this enthymeme that we talked about. Do you judge me faithful? Come to my house. Well, they don't come to her house. They're, which implies they're not judging her faithful. Rahab, to demonstrate her faithfulness, hides the spies. She does this scarlet cord. It's no one who's, everyone hopefully has read Joshua 2. If you haven't, go read it. If you have, read it again, because it's a really, really interesting narrative and episode. Yep. And she trusts Yahweh over Jericho, the town that she's from, which is a huge, enormous leap. No one would expect that to happen from particularly a stereotype of a prostitute like Rahab, or someone of, even if she's an innkeeper, like some try to argue, it's still someone from the margins of society. Lydia, same thing. She overthrows these ethnographic stereotypes that we talked about, economically, sexually, culturally, and so forth. She opens her house as the base for the Philippian church, right? And then from the payoff of this comparison, God doesn't start his big moves by partnering with ideal insiders. He partners with insiders. He starts, with insiders and hucksters. These people who are suspect. Go read. You got a Matthean scholar. Go read Matthew 1. There's 4 women mentioned in the genealogy, and all of them are women that have suspicious backgrounds, all sexual in all 4 instances, right? So, there's some really interesting things happening here, and you read these 2 texts off of each other. I think you get a lot more out of both. Whether it's intentional or not, I'm not sure, but you can read 2 texts intertextually, which you're doing.
Absolutely.
Right, and it brings out a lot of fascinating meaning.
Yeah, I think the nuances that come out when you can hear that previous story, and if you don't, fine, just read the story. But if you can hear it, there's a richness that begins to echo and reverberate and really enriches the telling of the story.
I believe you're right.
So let me move to some big picture. How does Acts 16 sound like other parts of Luke Acts? So we've been looking at Lydia through ethnography and the Rahab comparison, but let's take it in a slightly different direction. If you're just listening to Luke's own language, where does Acts sound like other parts of Luke Acts? So the intratextual and not just the intertextual or the cultural side.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And there's actually surprisingly a number which bring out a lot of meaning in this text. You have Luke 24, the Emmaus story, where you have the opening of the hearts and the eyes of the 2 guys who are on this road by Jesus. And the constraining of a guest to stay. Well, you have the same thing happening here, right? You have Lydia's heart opening up. You have the jailer's heart opening up, and you have her, constraining them, trying to compel them to accept her hospitality. In Luke 19, Jesus, refers to the temple. He's gotten there, or he's reaching Jerusalem at that point in time, where the house of prayer is called a den of robbers. So one can see how, this place of prayer, which is inhabited by a Lydian, with all the ethnographic connotations that comes with a Lydian, you could see that might be a den of robbers at the same time. Lydian merchants, a woman on top of it, and so forth. Luke 8, the Gerasene demoniac, he says, Most High God. There's a ton of, look at all the times going in, going out. There's a lot of coming and going with the spirits and prophet and so forth in Luke 8, just like there is specifically with the Pythian girl here in this particular text. Luke 16 also has an intertextual connection. You have this rich man. This is the other place where purple's used, clothed in purple. Purple is a test of wealth and compassion, and he fails. So what is Lydia going to do in this case, right? She's a purple seller. Well, she actually succeeds, where the rich man, who is unnamed in Luke 16, fails. So you place, Acts 16 against all of these texts, you get some really interesting connotations.
When you say that the house of prayer in Luke 19 and the den of robbers, you're not suggesting that Lydia is corrupt. You're just saying that's how, when she's introduced, that's how she might be perceived.
That's her stereotype. They're out of this house,
stereotype.
The place of prayer. They're not praying, and now we have a Lydian in this location. Maybe it isn't a place of prayer; rather, it's a den of robbers. den of Lydians who are out selling sham purple goods, is what one could actually conclude, right?
But what we encounter is something perhaps a little different.
Yeah. Well, just to dive into this in a little more detail, which you already have in the chart
Yeah.
on the screen for watching YouTube, Luke, the Emmaus story, disciples on the road, confused, slow of heart. Jesus opened the scriptures to them. Later, their eyes are open and they recognize him. Then they urge him to stay. They constrain him to stay with us, they say. Lydia's scene, you have echoing about the Lord opened her heart in verses 14 and 15. The same verb family is used here as the verb family back in 24. So there's parallels there and intentional parallels, in my opinion. The scripture, eyes open to recognize Jesus, which is what happened in this particular episode in the case of Lydia, or she demonstrates it if you read all the way through the end of the episode. After baptism, she urges them, just like the two disciples urged Jesus to stay with them back in the Emmaus scene. There's some interesting parallels that happen here. The house of prayer, the den of robbers. We sort of already talked about that, which is quite fascinating. Right. The Gerasene demoniac. There's a whole podcast we could do on each of these scenarios, quite frankly. But he cried out, "Jesus, Son of Most High God," in Luke 8:26 through 39 is where it occurs. Falls before Jesus. And then we have this Pythian girl, as you said, she cries out after Paul with the same type of language, Most High God, which I think is the only two instances in, I may be wrong, Luke Acts where this is actually used. And then the 16 episode, the same thing, which we already described. Just some great parallels here, which are intra-textual connections, which add a lot of meaning to this particular passage.
Right. Yeah, those are things that it's worthwhile to have this passage open and those other passages and looking back and forth make for great sermons. So let me go with back to Acts 16 for a moment. When Luke seems to be playing with repeated words, as you say, the God Most High, which he only shows up in that other passage in Luke. How do intratextual repetitions inside this chapter work? So we get the ones, the God Most High, we get the mad statement that you mentioned earlier. How does John Mark in Acts 15, just comes before, sit in the background of this theme about trust, especially if Acts 16 has some conquest overtones to us?
No, great question. Well, we read 15 and we think, they had this Jerusalem conference. They sorted out all their conflict and everything was settled. And then we fail to read the very end of chapter 15. We have this episode of John Mark where, Barnabas wants to take him. And the text says Paul adamantly does not want him to bring him along. In fact, he's so adamant, he's willing to depart ways with Barnabas, who, has been portrayed very, very positively up until this point.
Exactly.
In the book of Acts. And he goes off with Silas, and Barnabas disappears, and John Mark disappears, and they never come back into the storyline, which is quite fascinating. And we typically will skip right over that when we're reading the Lydia encounter in chapter 16. So Paul, the concept at the end of 15 is let's go back and visit the brothers in every city where we have already preached and evangelized. Right? That's in verse 36 of chapter 15. And it sort of sets, campaign language, if you may. The conquest, we're going back in as a military group. But it says John Mark earlier had withdrawn from them, which is the same root, the word here is apostasy. So, what is, you have all these arguments portrayed positively, negatively, neutrally, negatively, absolutely, unequivocally, in my opinion, based on the use of this particular word. And Paul, it says, did not consider it right. That's did not consider it right is literally what it means here. Right. And the mission splits. And the question is over what? It seems that trust is to play here, right? Apostasy, faithfulness, and trust. When we look at this word faithfulness or faith, pistis in particular, I think we underplay the broader connotations that it has. In this case, it has this concept of those who are faithful to the campaign, to the conquest. Look at all the Old Testament stories. There's a lot of people who were not faithful to that. Look at Achan, as Stan discussed a couple episodes ago with us, right? So then you have the intensity fueled in this particular episode with the Macedonian guy, all this military language of, pleading with them, urging them, and then we need help, which, one assumes, well, if you're reading military text, it's going to come in the form of troops or supplies and armaments and so forth. So it's really interesting here that, this word faith takes on broader meaning really of loyalty and hospitality, which is really how Luke Acts portrays it as John. So faith is much broader than just belief. It's, the actual enactment. It's belief followed with actual action, in my opinion.
Faithfulness. Yeah.
Precisely. Yeah.
Right. Well, and you're right. We almost never read the Mark issue with the Macedonian coming after it. Of course, you read that way sequentially, but you don't put the two together whatsoever. But if what I'm here, just to be clear, what you're suggesting is that there's some reconquest language. Paul wants to go back to places they've already been, and Mark is not willing to for whatever reason. And now you've got this Macedonian who
has passed the faith test. Ray, if you read Joshua 2, which is that conquest scene, right? Your military language. Rahab certainly passes it, right? You get here, right. Lydia passes it, and then the jailer, which we really haven't talked much about, we'll talk a little bit about him before we're done here. He passes it as well. So you have these individuals who are passing the faith test, but John Mark failed it miserably, right? To the point where Paul will have nothing to do with it and won't even take him along. But he'll trust a huckster. He'll trust a prostitute Rahab, if you read that intertextuality, or he'll trust a jailer who beat the heck out of him and Silas, and threw him back in the recesses of the jail, and took pride in torturing them. That he fulfilled. Talk about stereotypes. He's the stereotypical jailer in many ways.
So Macedonia becomes a new frontier because the places Paul intended to go back to were over in Asia and Galatia, Cappadocia and places like that. So this is a new territory that they're going into. And so you're suggesting that there's some military language that's there. But there's also other language around faithfulness that include more than just words of faithful. Things like somebody is battle ready or well spoken of, or are there other kinds of words that we might want to look for?
No, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that much, to be candid. There probably are, but I mean, it extends to hospitality in the scenes, steadfastness, and someone who's willing to overturn the stereotypes that are associated with them at the same time. Think of the jailer, think of Lydia, think of Rahab. These are individuals who demonstrated faithfulness by rejecting the stereotypes that are typically associated with them. The two lords don't, right? They embrace the prophet, just like the guy back in Luke 16 does, the rich man and Lazarus, right? They embrace their stereotype, and look where that gets them, right? And then in many ways, there's an irony here in that I think we're going to talk about that with the jailer here in just a moment. There's an irony associated with the magistrates where, they think they're following the law, but in reality, they violated the law. And they're not the good Romans. They're the exact opposite. And Lydia is.
Right. So let's say just a little bit more about the jailer as a faithful person. We've mentioned him just a little bit. What does the jailer do that shows faithfulness?
Well, and first of all, you have to think about, the jailer as a stereotype, because you hear you're a jailer. Well, you think local sheriff or, whatever, right? Which typically is relatively positive in our society. If you're seen as a jailer, you're someone that, looks out for the rights of others. You're in a hard environment that you try to ensure that the right things happen within that environment. Jailers in antiquity, that was not the stereotypical image of them. One, they're part of the penal state, and the intent of a jailer was just not to, make sure that someone didn't escape, which you have that connotation here, but it was they were trained to be brutal people. Kind of in this case, the jailer initially embodies all of those stereotypical ethnographic elements that you expect to see happen in the case of a scene portraying a jailer, right? He brutalizes them, and then he's worried about his own life, for what he had, they escaped. Just like go back to Acts 12, those guys are killed, right? those jailers are put to death because they let Peter escape. That's what he expects is going to happen here. So, you have this concept of, the holding cell, the prison. It's a place of punishment, break. You want to humiliate the prisoners. It's a place of torture, as I said. After the beating with rods, they're thrown into prison. The jailer is told to keep them secure. And in response, he puts them in the very inner part of the prison. Secure doesn't mean throw them all the way down in the worst part of the prison with all the infection and disease and muck and mud and everything else that exists down there. That's where he puts them. And he fastens their feet in the stocks, the text says. And they weren't, do you need to do that? No, he did that for torture. So he's an embodiment of the penal system in Roman antiquity. Harsh, hard, brutal, desensitized to what's actually happening to the people.
What if he's loyal? He's loyal to the magistrates. Yes,
precisely. Yeah.
Maybe out of fear, but he's still loyal to them. So how does his transformation come about?
That's a great question. So you have, no prayer happening at the place of prayer, but you have prayer happening here in the middle of this prison, this penal system, right? The last place you expect it to happen in a Greco-Roman narrative. They're praying, they're singing hymns. The other prisoners are listening. It says you have this earthquake, probably not apocalyptic. Some try to think, no, it's just an earthquake, right? But it is an expected pattern intratextually. With Acts 5, you have it happen there. You have it, as we mentioned, in Acts 12 with the Peter Rhoda scene. And also, you have type scenes of prison breaks in Greco-Roman literature, miraculous event, the prisoners escape, the guards are shamed, typically executed. That's how this type scene, and that's not what happens here, right? The miracle usually is, portrayed with the miraculous jailbreak. And in this case, when the jailer is about to kill himself, Paul's telling him, don't harm yourself, for we're all here, right? They could have, right? This type scene is they would have escaped. They would have left, like Peter. Peter left him in the lurch, and his jailers got it. Herod nailed him as a result. In this case, Paul, Silas, and the we group, it's just kind of, they disappeared. They escaped this. That's a whole different concept. What happened to the we group? They were there, and then, the going got tough. And the we group got going. They left. They're not there anymore, which is interesting, right? In and of itself. But here you have, Paul and Silas staying because the jailer would have met, based on the narrative, go read Acts chapter 12, would have probably been killed as a result of, this jailbreak. But they don't leave, right? So, that's what sort of leads to his conversion, right? And then he asks this concept of, what must I do to be saved? That's after he woke up, and how do I avoid it may have a double entendre here. How do I avoid, being killed? Because that's what's going to happen here. I'm going to be punished and probably killed as a result, executed as a result of it, due to the dishonor of allowing these guys to escape, who I was supposed to be guarding. But at the same time, it has this concept of, Luke's salvific activity. So it has a double meaning here, if you may. That's a great question.
So one of the first meanings, as you mentioned, is just how do I avoid the punishment that might come from the magistrates and their collusion with these guys who helped get Paul and Silas thrown into prison in the first place. But what does Luke mean by, by being saved? What's Luke's larger theological?
Books written on that. To your point,
so, right, the nutshell
I'll try to summarize them in 2 sentences. And to your point, Paul and Silas, ironically, are called what? Lords. The same thing called, which is ironic, play back on the fact that these guys that got him jailed in the first place, now they were the Lords. Now Paul and Silas are the Lords. So there's this concept of reversal, which we've talked about, happens frequently in Luke Acts. Tell me what your question was again. Sorry.
So what? When the jailer's asking this, how is Luke transforming what may be just a very pragmatic? How do I keep myself from getting
salvation. Yeah, I mean, it's
to
salvation, and then how do they act? Just like Lydia, right? Lydia wants to offer them hospitality. They won't accept. He offers them hospitality. He comes, he's baptized. What does he do? He washes their wounds because they had the hell beat out of them, if you may, right? In jail. They're beat up, bloodied, and certainly severely injured, and he's washing their wounds. So there's a salvific implication that takes on here that he's washing and giving care to Paul and Silas, just as he was baptized right beforehand. So, it certainly is one where there's a transformation that takes place with the jailer. And Joel Green has a book on conversion. It's a very readable book, and it's not too terribly long, and it's not too expensive. So it's a book that I would encourage your audience get your hands on if you're interested in more about this concept of conversion in Acts and Luke, for that matter.
So as part of his conversion, you mentioned that there's this term Lord that gets used. Is he talking about saved not from the people I've been afraid of, but saved from or for, or however, whatever preposition you want to use, your Lord?
Could be. I mean, it has two connotations, right? He was afraid of the two lords that got the magistrates riled up and had him jail them, and led all these subsequent actions. That certainly is going on, but it could have this dual implication to your point that, I want to be saved from your Lord at the same time. What does that mean? That means action on his part that shows, repentance, which is certainly what transpires in this particular scene.
Which in and of itself would be dangerous as a transformation of his loyalty.
Yeah.
That may get into more trouble.
Yeah, in the long run. He surprisingly, nothing happens to him here. It doesn't seem to be the case, but to your point, it was quite plausible that there would have been implications.
Right. Well, of course, we haven't got to the part where Paul's going to get his lords in trouble themselves. But before we get there, how does the jailer's conversion come alongside Lydia's? What parallels and contrasts stand out to you?
This is part of that intertextuality that plays out. It can be, between different episodes and scenes in a narrative. It can be within the scene itself. We already talked about the calling and the urging and so forth. Here you have baptism. They're both baptized, them and their households, which is that household narrative thing that we like to talk about, or many church traditions like to talk about. You have her urging them to come to her house and stay. You have the jailer taking them along with him at that very hour of the night. He washes their wound. He puts food before them as a host, as a benefactor, if you may. And you do have some contrast at the same time, right? Lydia, is a purple seller, comes into the story through a respectable prayer context, supposedly, but like we talked about, there's undercurrents there. And the jailer, is the typical stereotype. And he serves that stereotype, at least at the forefront. With Lydia, she never really does. We just are assuming, we're making assumptions that she is, but she never does, right? And her urging, and asking them, constantly to come to their house for hospitality, we might read as, her being this purple huckster, from Lydia. But as you progress through the story, you read back into it what that really means. And maybe you get that connotation if you're looking at the intratextual connection back with the Macedonian man. One who's being alert to the text may see a crack there already in her stereotypical ethnographic characterization.
Right. So hers is overcoming maybe the stereotype. His is actually a transformation. He turns from being one kind of a jailer to a very different kind of a person, and both marked, as you say, by hospitality.
Yeah.
So with this larger notion, the salvation isn't just forgiveness for sins in the way that we would say. You're linking salvation to an inclusion in a community where care is given for each other.
Yeah, it takes hospitality, which Josh talked about this in his podcast, is ubiquitous across almost every story you encounter in Luke Acts. Right. And that's certainly the case here, right? It's this, you're part of the community, and hospitality, reciprocal hospitality occurs between the different members, and the care that they show to Paul is, representative of what that means.
Right. Well, we can't leave this episode without getting to one of the I would say humorous parts. I'm sure it's not humorous for some. These magistrates who represent the power of Rome, but who get called out. Say a little bit more about what Paul does to them.
Well, let's start off. They accuse Paul and Silas of teaching customs that are contrary to the Roman customs, right? That they're doing things that are antithetical and riling everyone up. And they present themselves kind of in a puffed up manner as, we're the guardians of Roman law and identity. But later on, when you get to the end of the episode, or near the end of the episode, verse 37, Paul tells them, hey, you probably aren't who you say you are. You've beaten Roman citizens, uncondemned, and thrown them into the prison, which is against Roman customs. So they accuse Paul of the very fact of what they do is what they accuse Paul and Silas of, which is irony. And it's sort of a self-commendation, if you may, right? They, as a result, they're afraid, which is, typically portrayed in a negative fashion in Luke Acts, or a reaction to some kind of divine activity that, is overwhelming to those in the audience and the characters who are observing it. And then they come and they do exactly what the Macedonian man told them did, as well as Lydia, right? They beg, they urge, same verb there. Parakaleo. They asked them, beg them, urge them to leave the city. So we violated Roman law. Oh, can you leave the city? At the same time. So, there's a reversal of honor that takes place here. They're supposed to embody courage and justice. They're fearful. They're begging them, urging them to leave the city. It's a very un-Roman trait to show fear, as I mentioned. Paul, however, refuses a quiet exit, which is kind of, so suddenly he takes on courage, right? Instead of leaving the city, protecting himself, he goes to Lydia's house, it says, right? He insists on a public acknowledgement of wrong, right? He wants them to say, we did you wrong. He forces them to come out and say that. They colluded with the profit-seeking lords, not Paul and Silas, but the other lords over a slave girl.
Right.
The Roman customs, as I mentioned, are the ones the very laws that they're violating. They come across as counterfeit Romans. Paul and Silas, however, look like true Romans, right? They're the ones who are embodying the Roman ideal, the jailer, Lydian, and so forth, which is sort of an overturning of the stereotype. So some interesting things happening in this passage.
Yeah, and there's the generic, you're teaching what is not according to Roman custom, which of course is just very generic. You have no idea what they're doing. We kind of assume it has to do with circumcision or something like that, but nothing's ever specified. Whereas Paul calls out their actual technical legal requirements that they aren't doing. And likewise, the very specific kinds of actions, they beat him, which they're not supposed to do. And
they're supposed to have a trial, like they sort of do. But then you have Festus is it Festus? I think it's Festus who wants the bribe. He keeps Paul in prison because he's hoping for a bribe.
Yeah.
Right. It just shows the corrupt, so he's a counterfeit Roman there.
Right. So these really show the corrupt counterfeit side, as you say, versus the kind of genuineness that comes with these who have converted, right? And this, we get back to the hospitality, which is where the story seems to end. We finally get Paul back with Lydia.
Yep.
Why does the story end with that?
Well, it sort of begins with that, or it begins with the Macedonian and then Lydia, and it has this glaring gap, this sort of a negation as well, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it from the reader response standpoint, where she's converted. She asks them, if you believe me to be faithful, then let me show you hospitality. And they don't let her, right? She urges them, she begs them, right? She pushes against them, and they still won't acquiesce. They go about, rubbing away their time in Philippi, if you may, right?
Right.
And it ends with her. So, and that's why I think there's a indirect connotation with, echo with Joshua too, where the text literally says they went into the Lydian, this kind of sexualized connotation is sort of a pun. We know that's not what they were doing there. The reader knows that, right? Because we've seen her to be faithful. And the fact they went into her house, they're acknowledging her faithfulness. So that's what really brings it full circle in a way, right? You have, this gap of, are you going to find me faithful? And it's dropped. We don't know they found her faithful until the very end of the story when they go into her house and she's able to demonstrate and show them hospitality. And that confirms her loyalty, in essence, in this scene.
But with almost like with those inclusios, you begin the story and end the story at the same place. And part of what you show in the middle is the illegitimacy, in a sense, of a particular set of people and the legitimacy of people who shouldn't be, right? It's the role reversals that
the ones who are Roman magistrates are supposed to be the embodiment of these ideals, but in reality, it's this Lydian who you expect not to be an embodiment of that, and then the jailer sort of is a different type of creature in and of himself, in that he is one who's going to look out for himself, be brutal, but suddenly there's a complete conversion, reversal experience on his part where he's transformed. Right. And becomes like one, just like Lydia. So what Lydia has been wanting to show to Paul and Silas, he shows to them first, and then they finally go to her house where she's able to dispense the hospitality to them.
So that gets the Lydia and the jailer and the magistrates. What do we do about this slave girl who just disappears?
I think she's just a character that is in the narrative to move it along, if you may. I think we may be reading too much into it when we can certainly apply a deconstructionist approach here and show how, it's an embodiment of how texts were written, where the marginalized are taken advantage of. In this case, there's no commentary about her. She simply disappears because she's there for our benefit and for the benefit of the narrator and the implied author to move the narrative along in this case. And the implied author and us as readers really don't care about her unless we're willing to read it from a deconstruction standpoint, where we see that, she is neglected. She was taken advantage of. And the fact that she was exercised, she went from being profitable to worthless, at least in the eyes of her owners. And who knows what happened to her? She may have been sold away as a sexual slave, sold to the mines. She could have been killed, just completely abandoned. We don't know, because she suddenly went from profitable to worthless. And it is an interesting concept, but from a narrative standpoint, the focus is on the lords and the fact they're greedy and they're violating the hospitality and benefaction standards that we see established earlier in the narrative in Luke Acts.
She just helps. She gets to be the vehicle to help the narrative move into that conflict. Yeah, that's in some ways you feel, because you want to know that something good happens here. And so much about this entire episode, we want to feel good about. We want to feel good about Lydia.
Good happens to so many other characters in Luke Acts. We are almost expecting it to happen, but it doesn't, because she's a vehicle for a larger purpose, I guess, in the narrative, in this case, to your point.
So now we've gone through this passage, and we could probably spend even more time on, but our time's running out. You've kind of destroyed my feel-good reading of this and the lovely time I have at Lydia with my feet in the water there at the site called Lydia. What am I supposed to do with this now? I'm gonna have to give a whole new spiel on the trip.
Yeah, you got to change your sermon in Philippi this coming summer, I think, as a result of it, aren't you?
I'm gonna have a whole new sermon.
It keeps the inspiration, but it turns up the discomfort in many ways, right? The inspiration is Lydia. We walk away thinking, man, Lydia is a great character here. We just are seeing her in a completely different sense, right? We're seeing, we have strong women, we have liberation, we have conversions, we have baptisms, but, we have at the same time ethnographic suspicion. As readers, we put ourselves in the shoes of at least those who were the earliest readers of Luke Acts. I mean, they would have seen her as being suspicious, as someone who, had certain ethnographic connotations associated with her that were not positive at all. We'll see some economic exploitation the Pythian slave girl. We have the penal violence, right, that we often miss because we skip ahead to they were praying and singing. Well, what happened to them before? Because it was an embodiment of the penal system in Rome, and they were really tortured. And we have this complete transformation of the jailer in this case, right? And then we have the Roman hypocrisy of the magistrates, and then these two lords at the same time, if you want to associate themselves, the two groups together, which you can, as just being completely corrupt and counterfeit Romans in many ways. So, the vision wasn't a call for a clean church plant with respectable members. That's how we read it. Yeah, we got this church, we got this model, we're going to relay it, we're going to do a Philippian church plant in this location. That's not what it is. It's a call to a Lydian huckster, who has to beg them, and they finally show up at their house at the very end of the story after her purported conversion, right? You have, the life of a Roman torturer who's transformed in reverse, and you have a place of prayer in a city that is entangled with all the power and profit machinations that play out in the scene. So you got a heck of a sermon, in my opinion, when you start to read all these undercurrents in this text, which we've never read before. And then, if you want to tie it back to, earlier episodes in Luke Acts, there's a bunch of them. We've talked about some already in this podcast series. You have Rhoda, you have the Ethiopian eunuch, you skip ahead to the end of chapter 28, you have the Maltese barbarians, Josh is reading them. That's fabulous. You have Julius the Centurion in chapter 27. And we're going to talk about a few more, but I'm going to give away the entire story. We have a few more episodes coming up where we'll sort of deconstruct the text. And then if you read this intertextual connection with Rahab, it really, I think it lightens up the text and adds even more color to it. It becomes purple, if you may.
Yeah. The scarlet thread and the purple cellar here.
That's true.
So
it was the same word, man. We'd have a great intertextual connection.
Oh, then we really have it going.
We go to town.
Well, this series has been about these so-called marginal characters that upset our readings. And that seems to be part of what Luke's doing throughout Luke and Acts, is disrupting the notion of what the growth of the church is about, what God's Spirit is doing. It certainly gives a whole new meaning to what we use in the contemporary church as the Macedonian call, often associated with certain missions activity, because it is showing up in ways that the reader just is not ready to expect. And those who you might expect to behave in one way end up being quite the opposite, both good to bad and bad to good.
Really, who is church? Who are believers? Who are faithful? Who's the good soil, or the seeds thrown into the good soil? If you look at chapter 8 of the Gospel of Luke, it's transformative. Exactly. It's a much different mix of people than you really expect when you begin to read episodes like this one.
Well, Patrick, this has been another wonderful addition to our series. I want to thank you for your time and your expertise here. For our listeners, you can catch our companion article on scriptureworks.com. Listen in for not only, obviously, you're listening for this episode, but come back for our next episode and go back and check out some of the other episodes that we have referenced in this. And we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.